Think of the coldest night you've ever lived through, the kind where the wind bites like broken glass and the air turns your breath into knives, the kind where the silence isn't peace, but the absence of life. Now imagine that night stretched across months. Not one hard evening, but a winter so long and black, even the sun seemed to give up. That was the Viking world in January of the year 873. In the highlands above the fjords of Hålogaland, the sky had gone black for days. Not from clouds, not from snow, but from something else. A deep, silent ash had crept in from the east, choking out the stars, muting the moon. Farmers whispered of fire mountains in the north, of gods in rage. But there was no time for fear. Fear burned calories. Fear got you killed. Inside the half-buried longhouse of Jarl Fridis, a family of 12 curled under hides, dogs at their feet, stone warmth at their backs. The fire had gone out hours before, not from lack of wood, but because smoke could kill them faster than cold. Raiders had been spotted on the coast, sails blacker than the sky, and firelight was a death signal. One flicker, and your home could be raided before dawn. So they lay still. Beneath their backs, stones still warm from the earlier hearth flickered with fading heat. Raiders had banked them with care, rolling the river stones in thick bear hides before sliding them under the benches. She had done this every night since the sky changed. Since the sun stopped rising the way it used to, she didn't sleep. Her ears were tuned to the wind, to the rustle of moss-stuffed boots being kicked off in the dark, to the cough of her youngest, 5 winters old and already shivering under 3 layers of greasy wool. She reached a hand out and pressed it to his chest. Still breathing, still warm. "Don't sleep too deep," she whispered into her husband's back. "We'll need water before sunup or what's left of it." But he didn't answer. He was too far gone in that winter sleep. The heavy, dreamless kind, where bodies conserve energy like a dying fire holds its last ember. She hated waking him, but frost came faster when people slept too hard. She pressed her body closer, shared her warmth, and closed her eyes just enough to rest. Not sleep, just rest. Outside, frost gripped the earth like a frozen fist. Even the dogs didn't whimper. The family had eaten late, thick broth, heavy with fat, scraped from the last seal kill. Not a feast, not joy, fuel. A child's spoonful of fermented butter, sour and heavy, had been the only thing that saved them from shivering before midnight. They had more buried in the pit behind the longhouse, but digging in the dark risked exposure, not just to cold, but to watchers, men who killed for cloaks and smoked meat. Freydis remembered when the winters used to be hard but honest. You knew where the sun was. You knew when the raids came. You knew when to expect the storms. But this black sky, it was different. The old men in the village said the gods had turned their faces away, that this wasn't just winter, it was warning. Still, she refused to believe in fear. Fear was a hole you fell into. Fear made your hands shake when you needed to strike. Fear made you waste your last fat-rich broth on a second helping instead of saving it for morning. So they slept in their shared heat, side by side like cattle in a barn, breathing slow and deep. Even the wealthiest among them lived like this now. There were no kings in cold like this, just survivors. Underneath their bed the straw was fresh. She'd spread it herself that morning, and layered it with rush mats, hides, and a bit of woven wool she'd stolen from a richer farm 2 winters ago. She wasn't proud of it. But her children were alive. Above them the sod roof held. Ice clawed the beams but didn't break through. Not yet, at the edge of sleep. Freydis thought of the river stones under her back, how hot they had glowed hours ago, pulled straight from fire, wrapped in skin. That fire was long gone now, but the stones still whispered warmth, just enough. Maybe that's all survival was. Not fire, not strength, but knowing how to hold on to heat when everything else wanted to take it from you, and when the sky went black. That's how the Vikings conquered fear. They didn't wait for the gods. They built their own warmth. The next morning came without light, not a sliver, not a glow, not even a promise on the horizon. The sky above the fjord stayed the color of ash, choked and silent. It had been nearly 10 days since they last saw the sun. And this morning, like the ones before it, the cold was sharper than hunger. Freydis rose before the others. Her knees cracked from sleeping on straw and stone, and the chill in her joints was worse than pain. It was a warning. She eased herself off the bench without waking the boy beside her. His cheeks were red with cold, but he was alive. For now, she reached for her cloak, coarse wool, tight-woven, greasy from lanolin. She pulled it over her shoulders, followed by her thickest tunic. 3 layers, then fur. Her boots were packed the night before with dry moss and straw, changed by her eldest, Sigrun, just before nightfall. Without that daily ritual, her feet would have blackened by now, not from bruises, but from frostbite. She stepped carefully, avoiding the loose floorboard where snow had seeped in last month. The longhouse creaked like a wooden ship in a storm. The turf walls wept moisture. Her hand brushed the beams above, dripping with condensation from their own body heat. By the hearth, she knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the ash pile, still warm. The stones below had done their job. She pulled one out, still wrapped in bear hide, now charred and steaming. It hissed in the air. Good. That meant it held heat through the dark. She'd reheat it later once it was safe to light a flame. If it ever was. She peeled back the curtain that blocked the door. Outside, the wind didn't howl. It whispered. And somehow that was worse. The snow didn't fall anymore. It just hung in the air, grey, like someone had scattered ash into the sky and forgotten to sweep it away. She stepped out, boots crunching into frost-caked mud. She didn't dare go far. Just to the water pit. The old wooden barrel sat half-buried behind a stone wall, surrounded by driftwood and seaweed. She punched the lid, frozen, again. She would have to chip at it quietly. No axes, no banging. Sound traveled too far in the still air. She used a knife, slow, deliberate, her breath fogged. Her fingers stung. But the ice cracked just enough. Behind her she heard steps. Sigrun. 16 winters, sharp eyes like her father's. She moved silently, like she'd grown up in war. "Mother," she said quietly. "We need more moss," Freydis nodded. "Take the boys. Only what's dry. You know what happens with wet." Sigrun nodded once and vanished back into the house. Freydis looked at the sky again. She wasn't sure if it was dawn or dusk. She didn't even know if there was a difference anymore. They used to measure time by the sun. But now the days had blended into a single grey thread, pulled tight by hunger and cold. Last night one of the cows had stopped eating. That was bad. If it died, they'd have to butcher it fast before the meat froze solid or raiders smelled the blood. But if they killed it now, they lost its warmth. A living cow was more than food. It was a furnace. She'd slept beside one once, back when her village burned, and she'd fled with nothing but a fur and a knife. That cow had saved her life. She returned inside. Her husband was awake now, bare-chested, wrapping his feet in moss, his fingers moving slow. She could see it in his skin. The cold was sinking in. He wouldn't last many more nights without more fat. "We'll need the seal fat," she said. "We've 2 jars left." "That's 1 per night." He didn't answer, just nodded. He knew what she was really saying. If they didn't catch another seal or find another trade, someone wouldn't make it through the next black night. She went to the sleeping space. The boy had woken. He was gnawing on a hard biscuit, more salt than grain, but it was calories. He looked up at her with wide, sun-starved eyes. "Will the sun come back, Mama?" She hesitated. Her mouth wanted to say yes, but her soul whispered no. The sagas said there would be winters without end. Ragnarök began when the sun disappeared. She knelt, kissed his forehead, and pulled the furs tighter around him. "It will," she lied. "But until it does, we keep warm." And warmth wasn't fire. It was moss. It was stone. It was shared breath under wool blankets. It was boiled broth and fermented butter. It was dogs curled at feet and silence in the dark. It was hope, measured in calories, not courage. That night, when the sky stayed black, the family slept close again, huddled like wolves in a den. No one spoke. No one dared strike a flame, because in a world without light, fire wasn't safety, fire was death, and still they survived. By the 13th day, something had shifted. the sky still pressed down like a smothering blanket heavy with ash and silence. But it wasn't the sky that changed, it was the people. Freydis noticed it first in the children. They didn't ask about the sun anymore. They didn't ask when they could go outside or when the wind would stop howling between the cracks in the sod walls. They just moved, small, slow, quiet, like animals learning to live in a cave. Inside the longhouse, everything was about warmth now. Thought, breath, movement, it all revolved around one thing: don't lose heat. They had started layering the beds with extra straw. The old mats were tossed out, replaced with whatever dry brush or reeds they could find near the frozen shore. Even the walls had been reinforced. Freydis and her husband had taken to piling snow against the outside, creating insulation from the very thing that threatened them. It was the day's only strength, knowing how to turn a killer into a shield. At dusk, not that it looked different from noon, Sigrun returned from the moss run. Her hands were raw, fingers red and cracking from scraping dry lichen off boulders hidden under the snow. She'd lost one of her wool mittens 2 days ago. They'd stitched her a new one from rabbit hide, but it didn't fit right. Still, she said nothing. She just emptied the moss into the storage chest by the fire pit. Even though no flame had been lit for hours, the stones beneath still radiated a soft warmth. Not much, just enough to notice, just enough to matter. Freydis was stirring broth over a low ember bed, barely enough heat to simmer. The pot was bone black, the handle wrapped in rag to avoid burns. Inside, a seal bone, 2 chunks of root vegetable, and a ladle of whale fat floated in thick broth. It wasn't a feast. It was fuel. Each bowl was measured, not by volume, but by strength. Her husband got the most. He still had to go out each day to check the traps near the forest line. If he fell, they all would. Sigrun and the older boys got the next share. The little ones, only enough to keep them from shaking through the night. Freydis took the smallest scoop for herself. It tasted like seawater and rot, but it was warm. Later that night, as the family huddled beneath their mountain of hides, the wind began to rise. Not just a gust, a sound, a scream from the trees. Sharp, unnatural. The kind of wind that made animals whimper and babies cry. The kind of wind that meant something was coming. Freydis held her youngest closer. Her hand slipped into the fur beside the bench, gripping the small sayax knife they kept hidden for emergencies. Not raiding, not hunting, survival. "Don't open the flap," her husband whispered. She didn't answer. She wouldn't have anyway. The wind didn't sound like weather. It sounded like someone calling. Or something. The dogs growled. One barked, a single sharp warning, then silence. Freydis slowly sat up, careful not to shift the hides too much. Her eyes had adjusted to the dark weeks ago. She could make out the shapes of her children, the slow rise and fall of breathing. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Not from inside, outside, not fast, not sneaky, deliberate. She felt it in her chest. That weight. That old enemy, fear, but she didn't let it in. She didn't have the luxury. She gripped the knife tighter and nodded to her husband. He moved slow, rolling toward the door. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the cow. They were too poor to have guards, but they weren't stupid. If it came to it, the cow would give a warning. Or a delay. Minutes passed. The steps faded. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe just the wind in the drifts. But no one slept that night. The next morning, Freydis found tracks near the tree line. Too large for wolves, too small for a full-grown man. Raiders didn't walk alone, but whoever it was had stood outside the longhouse. Long enough to leave 4 perfect prints in the frost-hardened mud. She didn't tell the children. Instead, she told them to double the moss packs, recheck the stone pile, and reinforce the door with snow. The sky was still black. The wind still screamed. But they had survived another night, and survival, in these days, was the only victory. The next day was colder, not by much. Just enough that the broth froze solid in the pot before noon. Just enough that when Freydis pulled a stone from under the bench, it was no longer warm, but brittle, cracked from the night's frost. Useless, even the cow's breath came slower. Inside the longhouse, everyone spoke in whispers now. Not from fear, not exactly. It was the weight of the cold, the weight of weeks without sun, without firelight, without sound beyond wind and wolves. Their voices had become too expensive to use. Sigrun came to her mother in the mid-afternoon, at least what they guessed was afternoon. She held a square of cloth in her hand. It was frozen stiff. When Freydis unwrapped it, she found what was left of their seal fat. One jar had spoiled, cracked from freezing, ruined by mold. The second was half full, barely enough for 2 more nights. They would have to ration harder. Or someone would go without. Her husband suggested sending the boys to the coast. "Maybe a seal's come ashore," he said. Freydis stared at him like he was mad. "In this wind? With that sky? We can't eat moss," she wanted to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. And that made it worse. She called the boys, Egil and Kalf, 12 and 14. Not men, not boys. Just thin shapes wrapped in too much cloth, with knives too dull and hope too thin. "You'll go to the coast," she said softly. "Only as far as the cliff line, no fires. If you see anything strange, anything at all, you come back." They nodded, their eyes empty. They'd learned already. They didn't ask questions anymore. Freydis wrapped dried moss and a piece of wool around their feet herself. Then she gave them a strip of dried meat each, old cod hard as wood. The last from the upper shelf. She didn't tell her husband. They left in silence. Inside, she turned her attention to the hearthstones. Most were too cold now. She had 3 that still held heat from the previous day. She pushed them deep into the ash, banked them tight, and said a short prayer, not to the gods, but to the stone. Because in this winter, stone was more faithful than Odin. She added brush and slivers of wood. She couldn't make a full fire. The risk of smoke was too high, but a low ember might relight the stones. She worked slowly. The sound of the flint striking metal echoed too loud in the longhouse, but then spark, then ember, a whisper of heat. She laid a stone on it like an offering. It glowed red, just for a moment, then dulled. But that was enough. She'd heat the others through the night. They could rotate them under the sleeping bench. That plus their bodies, the dogs, the hides, it would be enough to survive, just enough, always just enough. But the boys hadn't returned by the time the dark returned. She waited by the door. The cow shifted behind her uneasy. Sigrun stood by her side, silent. They didn't speak. They just listened. The wind was wrong again. At first she told herself it was just nerves. But then came the smell, not blood, smoke. Someone, somewhere, had lit a fire. Freydis felt her stomach drop. No Viking in their right mind would light a fire in this kind of silence, unless they didn't care who saw, unless they wanted to be seen, or unless they were already dead. Her hand went to the knife, not the cooking blade, the real one. She gave Sigrun the signal to wake the youngest and push them into the inner space, under the sleeping platform, hidden with the dog pelts. She layered the straw above them like a blanket. It wasn't comfortable, but it was invisible. That's how you survived when the sky went black. You didn't make noise. You didn't call for help. You became invisible. They waited 1 hour, then 2, then finally steps, 2 pairs. She opened the door before they knocked. Egil and Kalf stood there, soaked to the bone, teeth chattering, eyes wide. "No seal," Egil said. "But we saw it." Freydis didn't like that tone. "Saw what?" He looked at her like a boy too young to lie, but too old to forget. The fire mama, on the other side of the fjord. Not ours. And someone was singing. She pulled them both in and slammed the door behind them. Singing in this cold, in this blackness. That was madness, or something worse, something that wanted to be heard. That night, no one slept, not from cold, though the cold was sharp as ever, cutting through cloaks, biting beneath fur, crawling up from the floor like a sickness. But sleep didn't come because something else had crept into the longhouse. Dread, not the kind that shouts, the kind that whispers, the kind that makes every creak of timber sound like footsteps, every gust of wind sound like a name. Freydis sat upright the entire night, her back against the hearth wall, the small knife still clutched in her palm. Egil and Kalf had curled near the stones, silent since returning. They hadn't imagined it, Both heard the singing, high-pitched, soft, carried by the wind from across the fjord. A lullaby, Egil had said, a woman's voice. And in Viking lands, songs sung in darkness weren't lullabies, they were warnings. Or worse, invitations. Freydis didn't tell the rest of the family. No one else needed to know. Fear spread like fire, faster than warmth, harder to contain. Instead, she made plans. At first light, or whatever passed for it in this sunless season, she would send her husband to the elders' hall. It was farther inland, dug deeper into the earth, surrounded by thicker turf walls. If this was a raider game, the elders would know. If it was something worse, well, better to face it together than alone. But morning never came, or rather, nothing changed. The sky outside was still black. Not storm dark, not cloud dark, dead dark, the kind that made you feel like the world had stopped spinning. By midday, the cow stopped eating again. Freydis didn't speak. She just ran her hand down its side, checking for fever. Nothing, just weakness. The kind of slow death that came from days without proper heat, without enough fat in the diet. If the cow died, they wouldn't just lose milk. They'd lose insulation. That night, her husband left, not to flee. To warn. He bundled himself in every layer they had. 2 wool tunics, a fur cloak, moss-stuffed boots, a bear pelt hood. The axe at his hip wasn't for hunting. It was for the path. Before he went, he pressed his forehead to Freydis's. "Don't let the fire out," he said, "even if it draws them." "I won't," she said. He didn't say goodbye. Vikings didn't believe in last words. He stepped into the black, and she was alone. Not really. Her children were there. The cow, the dogs, the warmth of the stones. But it felt like being alone, as if the longhouse had become a ship on a frozen ocean, adrift, surrounded by a black so thick it felt alive. Sigrun sat beside her that night, silent, sharpening the bone point of a fishing spear. She worked slow, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it was something to do. Something to keep the hands from shaking. "I heard it," Sigrun said finally. Freydis looked over. "The song," she added. "Last night. I didn't tell the boys, but I heard it too," Freydis swallowed. "What did it sound like?" "Like the sea," she said. "Like when you're under the water and someone's calling your name." Freydis said nothing. That night, the singing returned, fainter, closer. Freydis lay awake, her arm draped protectively over her youngest. The heat from the stones had faded faster tonight. Maybe they hadn't heated them long enough. Maybe the cracks were letting in more cold. Maybe fear made everything colder. The dogs whimpered once, then fell silent. The song kept coming, no words, just a sound. High, strange, distant, but never far enough, and somewhere deep in her gut, Freydis felt a truth she couldn't explain. That song wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. It was older than language. Older than the gods. She clenched her jaw and reached for the firewood. This time, she wouldn't let the hearth go dark, let them come. If death was coming, it could come to fire, not cold, not silence. The fire was small, but it was defiance. Freydis didn't build a roaring flame, just enough to catch the stones, to glow softly under a bed of ash, to feed the illusion of safety. Smoke crept low across the beams, thin as a ghost. She left the flap cracked just enough to let it drift, hoping the ash-choked sky would swallow the trail, but she knew the risk. A fire meant heat. Heat meant life, and life meant light, and light attracted eyes. Still, she let it burn. The children slept as well as they could, their small bodies wrapped in layers, curled together on the wide bench. Their breath fogged the air, but it didn't tremble with cold. That was something. She sat beside the hearth, her hands out, palms open. She didn't warm them. She listened with them. For the wind, for footsteps, for that song. But the wind was quiet now. Too quiet. She hated it more than the noise. Around midnight, or what passed for it, Sigrun stirred. "Mama," she whispered. "Something's outside." Freydis froze. "Where?" "I don't know. I just felt it. Like the ground moved." Freydis rose slowly, knife in hand, and crept to the door. She opened it with care. The night was black as ever. But the black had weight. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was presence. The presence of something watching. There was no wind, no footsteps, no song, but in the distance across the fjord, there was firelight, just one flame flickering behind the line of trees. A single orange glow, far too small to warm anything, but large enough to be seen. Freydis stared, and then it moved, not the fire itself, but the light, as if something carried it. Like a lantern, but no Norseman carried light like that. It bobbed, swayed, floated above the ground, then it blinked out. Freydis stepped back and closed the flap. She didn't tell the children. Instead, she pulled more wood from the hidden chest, fed the hearth again, and rotated the stones. They needed to hold heat until morning. If it ever came, by the next day, her husband hadn't returned. No word. No sound, no tracks, just silence. The cow collapsed that afternoon. It didn't cry. It didn't groan. It just folded, quiet, as if it had known this was its time. Freydis didn't hesitate. She sharpened the blade herself, called Sigrun to help, and began the butchering. Blood steamed on the frost-covered floor. The younger children were sent outside to gather snow, clean snow, to pack the meat. They worked fast. She didn't cry. There wasn't time. The warmth the cow gave in life would now save them in death. Fat would be rendered, organs boiled. Even the hide would be stretched over the doorway to block drafts. That was the Viking way. You mourned later, if you survived. That night they didn't hear the song. Instead, they heard laughter, not joyful, not human. It came from the trees, sharp, like bones snapping underfoot. Then silence, then a thud, something hitting the longhouse wall. Not enough to break through, just enough to say, "I'm here." Freydis didn't sleep. She sat with the axe across her lap, and her children curled behind her. Even the dogs had gone silent. She thought about her husband. Was he dead? Was he the one carrying the flame? Or worse, was he following it? Because whatever that thing was out there, whatever walked under the black sky carrying fire and singing lullabies, it didn't want warmth. It wanted witnesses. It wanted the longhouse to stay awake. And Freydis, bone-tired, frostbitten, half-starved, did exactly that. She stayed awake. She stoked the fire, and she waited for what came next. The fire died just before the new sound came, not the wind, not the laughter. This time it was a low hum, not loud but deep, so deep it vibrated through the walls, through the stone floor, through the bones in Freydis's chest. It didn't come from far off, it came from below. Freydis sat upright, her breath held in her throat. Her fingers clutched the axe handle so hard her knuckles cracked. Sigrun was already awake, crouched low, spear in hand, eyes wide but not afraid. Just focused, the way her father had taught her. The children stirred, restless under the hides. "Mama," one whispered. "What's that sound?" She didn't answer, because how do you explain to a child that you don't know what's beneath your feet? The longhouse had always been safe, dug into the earth, protected by turf walls, sod roof, heavy beams. They had made it that way. They trusted it. But now the very ground was humming, like something ancient shifting deep in the soil, like roots groaning or bones rolling over. The sound lasted only a minute. Then silence. Not the natural kind. The kind that waits. Freydis looked at Sigrun. "Pack the stones," she whispered. "All of them. Wrap tight." Sigrun moved without a word. They both knew what it meant. They might have to leave. Not for the Elders' Hall. It was too far now. Too dangerous. But maybe the old cave near the fjord mouth, where fishermen used to store nets in warmer times. It was cramped, cold, but sheltered, hidden. They'd survive a few nights if they could reach it, but before they could begin packing, the flap of the longhouse shifted. Not opened, not torn, just moved. Freydis froze. Her eyes snapped to it. It had been tied down with hide straps, sealed with moss and ice. But now it was swaying slightly, as if something just outside was testing it. The dogs didn't bark. They didn't growl. They whimpered. Then came the smell, not smoke. Not blood, rot, wet fur, dead seaweed, old flesh left too long in the sun. Freydis rose, gripping the axe in both hands. She motioned to Sigrun, "Get the children under the bench." No crying, no sound. The flap moved again. This time it stretched as if something was pressing on it. Not claws, not fingers, but something softer, wetter. Freydis stepped forward, 1 foot on the cold floor, one hand stretched behind her, ready to push the fire over if needed. Let the coals blaze. Let them burn the whole house if it meant protection. The dogs bolted, not at the flap, out the back, through the loose wall beam near the cow's pen. They vanished into the dark without a sound, and then the flap fell still, the smell faded, no more humming, just cold, just silence. Freydis waited a long time before speaking. Her voice was barely a whisper, whatever it was. It knew we were awake. Sigrun nodded. They want us to fear the dark, she said. Freydis smiled bitterly. We are the dark, she said. They just forgot who they're dealing with, and with that they packed. Every stone, every hide, every strip of boiled meat, every pouch of moss. No one asked questions. Even the smallest child helped. The longhouse had been home for 3 winters, but it was no longer safe. Before leaving, Freydis did something strange. She lit the hearth fully, let it roar, not for warmth, for war. If whatever watched them wanted to, let it find fire waiting, let it remember that when the sky went black, it wasn't fear that kept the Vikings alive. It was fire they left just before the frost claimed the last of the stones. Freydis led them, axe in hand. Her hood pulled tight, breath hissing like steam from her mouth. Behind her, Sigrun carried the smallest child strapped to her chest, and the others followed close, their steps nearly silent in the snow-packed mud. Each child wore everything they owned, layers of wool, moss-packed boots, bear-hide mitts. They looked more like bundles than people. They didn't speak. Not out here, not where the cold could carry your words away like whispers on a blade. The longhouse burned behind them, not a blaze, just a controlled fire, stones stacked in the hearth. Dry moss fed carefully beneath the planks. Enough to make smoke. A signal, a trap, a memory. If whatever had come to that door returned, it wouldn't find them. It would find ash. It took nearly an hour to reach the cliff path. The wind was sharper near the fjord. It cut through wool, tugged at cloaks, burned the nose. The children coughed but kept moving. That was what Freydis had taught them. You keep moving or you freeze. And if you freeze, you don't sleep. You die. By the time they reached the mouth of the cave, her hands were numb. Her lips cracked from wind. But they were alive. Inside, the cave felt like a grave at first, dark, hollow, damp. But once they cleared the entrance and laid down straw, hides, and warmed a few stones by emberlight, it began to feel like something else. A womb. Not a home, but a place to wait. To survive. The next 3 nights blurred. They ate small, slept in shifts. No singing, no fire bigger than a fist. Just embers and breath and heat passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, and in the dark stories returned. Freydis told them the old sagas, Odin hanging from the tree, Loki stealing fire, Thor walking through the land of giants alone. The children listened not for magic but for meaning. For the reminder that fear wasn't new, and neither was fighting it. Sigrun sharpened her knife every night, not for food, for whatever might follow them next. But nothing came. No footsteps, no laughter, no humming, only the wind, only the cold. And then one morning, just as Freydis had begun to doubt whether the sun would ever rise again, the sky turned grey. Not bright, not blue, but less black, enough that shapes appeared in the distance. Trees with edges, shadows that made sense. The dark was breaking, not fast, not with a scream, but slowly, like ice melting, like fear leaving the body after too many days held tight. That day, Sigrun climbed the cliff path and looked down over the fjord. She came back with a frozen fish in her hand and tears in her eyes. "Mama," she whispered, "the light is coming." Freydis didn't cry. She simply nodded and knelt by the smallest one, pulling the hide tighter around his shoulders. They had survived the black sky, not with magic, not with gods, but with stone, with fire, with fat and moss and wool, and instinct older than any rune. They had done what monsters could not. They had kept each other warm, and that is how the Vikings conquered fear. Not when the world burned, but when the sky went black, and they refused to let the fire die.